Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth episode of the Startup Playbook Hustle, a new segment of the podcast where I interview some of the best up-and-coming startups and founders on their journey, lessons, and challenges to date. My guest for this episode is Morgan Ranieri, the co-founder of YourGrocer, an online grocery delivery platform that connects you to local independent shops in Melbourne and Sydney. Prior to starting YourGrocer, Morgan was one of the co-founders of Thankyou, one of the best-known Australian startups in the FMCG industry. Morgan used his experience at Thankyou to help independent shops compete against the duopoly of Coles and Woolworths by helping them sell direct to consumers via the YourGrocer platform. Since launching in 2013, the company now has a network of 150 local businesses and has fulfilled more than 80,000 orders to date. The company has also raised a total of $3 million in funding from investors such as the Giant Leap Fund, Cyan and Tankstream Ventures. In this episode, we talk about the 4 pillars of building startups, balancing short-term goals versus long-term vision, building from first principles, and the consequences of growth. Without further ado, here is my interview with Morgan Ranieri. Hi Morgan, welcome to the Startup Playbook Hustle and thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Rohit.
So for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Sure. So I'm quite young, 28. About 10 years ago, when I was 18, met up with a group of friends and ended up joining a really exciting team, a social enterprise called Thankyou Water. It's Thankyou Group now, but at the time it was just a bottled water brand, and the whole idea was exciting. It was take this like crazy industry that is bottled water and try and use the profits from that to do our bit in solving the world water crisis. So got involved with that as a completely inexperienced 18-year-old, very excited, but sort of no idea of what I was actually doing. It was really exciting, sort of four and a half years involved there, building the sales, marketing, distribution, and really just cutting my teeth in startups and business in general. So did that for a while. Through that process, developed a really big sort of dislike for the supermarkets. In Australia, we have the second most concentrated supermarket ecosystem in the world in terms of competition after New Zealand. So, that makes it really hard to get any food or beverage brand off the ground. You have to be in Coles and Woolworths if you want a big brand. But if you're in them, your biggest risk is that if they drop you, you lose your brand. So, it's a really challenging space, Australia, to build a new business in food and grocery. So through that process, really, grew to not like Coles and Woolies. But then when I'd finished up at Thankyou and I was working a full-time job, I found myself shopping at Coles at 9 o'clock every Monday night, which I think most people listening to this podcast probably do because of convenience, right? Ultimately, you don't want to take your Saturdays and spend them shopping, and you can't take time out throughout the day to go to the butcher before they close at 5 p.m. So found myself doing that, realizing that like this just really doesn't line up with what I want to be doing. So thought how hard could it be to try and do this ourselves and make it easier to buy from the shops that you want to buy from. Turns out it's very hard, but again, naivety sort of helped us get cracking and get something off the ground, which is now grown into what is now YourGrocer. We're selling about $5 million a year worth of groceries from 60 shops across Melbourne. And the whole idea is that you can order or head to the website, put your postcode in and order from a range of local shops. So a butcher, baker, greengrocer, deli, an independent supermarket. We'll pick it up, deliver it all that same day. We have our own fleet of vans and drivers and a sort of growing base of customers across Melbourne. And a team of about 20 people. We've raised about $3 million in capital over the last few years, sort of slowly, a little bit at a time rather than in one big hit, which seems to be the case for a lot of Australian startups. And it's been a really exciting ride. The last sort of 4.5 years running YourGrocer has been incredible.
Fantastic. Obviously, I want to come back to YourGrocer and some of the incredible things that you guys are doing. But just picking out one of the things that you mentioned there was often when people are starting businesses, they're really naive, and especially, when you're starting something when you're 18, you kind of have this thing of, I think I know this, it's surely it's not that difficult, like with most things. And then as soon as you get into it and you start doing more and more, you kind of learn that there's so much that you don't know. What were some of the things that you maybe weren't expecting as much, or really kind of picked up through your 4.5 years with Thankyou that essentially helped you in building YourGrocer?
So one of the biggest things I learned at Thankyou is that no matter what your social message is, your core product needs to solve a need for a customer. There has to be something in it for them. For the first couple of years, all of our distribution was through IGAs, 7-Elevens, or for a while actually it wasn't 7-Elevens, it was IGAs, fish and chip shops, all the small places that you can think of buying a bottled water. And these people, of course, they like the idea behind what you're doing, but ultimately they need to make a margin on that product. So, how much money can they make selling that bottle of water as the retailer who's stocking it is incredibly important for the customer. Does it taste good? Does it look good? These are like really important things. I think we sort of started with this idea that people will get behind an idea and a mission, and they certainly do, but that's got to be coupled with a core product that's really, really good. And so I sort of had that in the back of my mind going into YourGrocer, probably to even a greater extent. I feel like I almost did a pendulum swing away from the message. I mean, I started YourGrocer with a strong sort of mission behind it personally, and I want to see Australia become a much more competitive food and grocery ecosystem and help local shops survive, and all sorts of values-driven things. But from when we spoke to our customers, it was all about utility. It was like, we are going to be the best, most convenient, best quality, best priced, greatest range online grocer, and we happen to also have a mission behind what we're doing. We probably went a bit too far to that angle and didn't play and sort of talk up that message as much. So I think we're kind of swinging back into the middle now. But yeah, the core product's just got to be friggin' amazing.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that. Obviously, running a growth marketing agency, we get pitched a lot of businesses who, just assume that just because you work with someone in marketing or in growth or brand messaging, that it's just going to explode your business.
Right.
And you can only market a business up to a particular point. To build a really sustainable long-term business, you need stickiness, and to have stickiness, people aren't going to stick around to the message if the product isn't good enough. The underlying product needs to be good enough, and the marketing and the messaging just helps you sort of get further exposure for that. But that all starts off with having a valuable product that solves a problem or provides an actual need for consumers.
Yeah, it's the first thing you learn in sales is your WIFM, the what's in it for me. You've got to get to that ASAP, or else people have a very short attention span.
Absolutely. So we first met at Startup Victoria pitch night. So we were going through 4 or 5 weeks.
Yeah, 4 weeks of pitch training.
Yeah. So obviously, anyone sort of looking at coming across YourGrocer now, incredible amounts of revenue. You've been able to successfully raise a few $1 million of funding as well. It all looks amazing. Obviously, it's been incredible to see how quickly you've grown this and how impressively you've sort of gone about in building YourGrocer. But for someone who wasn't potentially part of that sort of early part of that journey, what was it like for you in trying to having that YourGrocer concept of hating Coles and Woolies and wanting to do things for the independent grocers and sort of building that up from scratch?
I think the one word that describes the last 4.5 years for me and the journey is tension. There's just always been tension between where the business is and where I want it to be, and I only recently have started to realize that that's a good feeling and not a bad one. Tension feels bad. It feels like a negative emotion. And it's certainly not the kind of thing your massage therapist thinks you should have in your shoulders. But tension as an entrepreneur, I think, is really good. If you didn't have it, you would, plateau, right? You'd be happy with where the business is at. And for a lifestyle business, then the tension's probably not what you want. But for a startup, where growth is really the true north for quite a while, tension is good, and I think every month for the last 4.5 years has been a different kind of tension. It was either we're growing fast but our profits are not good enough, or our profits are good but our growth is not good enough, or our acquisition is great but now retention is slipping, or we've just found this fantastic way to accelerate our product, but it had some unintended consequence somewhere else. My business partner calls it the short blanket. Whenever we pull on one end to sort of pull the blanket up, your feet stick out the bottom and something else happens. So always tension, but I think that's natural. I came across this concept early on, which really helped me calm down a bit. I remember the first year or so at YourGrocer, I had quite a bit of anxiety about the idea of the product needs to be amazing, the team needs to be huge, we need to raise a lot of money, we need to grow with a lot of customers, and you want to sort of run ahead with all of those, or with one of those at a time. Actually, you want to sort of, for me, I found myself wanting to run ahead with one of them at a time really hard. So I want to get heaps of customers, or I want to raise heaps of money. And then I sort of came across this idea that those four things, like customers, team, product, and funding, are all like pillars, I guess, that need to grow in tandem with each other, and they shouldn't be out of whack. Like if you end up with too many customers too quick but not the right team or product to support that, then you'll fall over. If you end up with too much funding too quick, you'll do what Webvan did in 1999 and completely fall over. If you grow the team too big without growing the customers or the product, there's all these sort of consequences of getting them out of whack with each other. So I think I sort of learnt to not push too hard in it, or not get them out of sync. Grow them all obviously as fast as you can, but in sync with each other.
Sure. Speaking of tension, how do you balance, when you have different options on the table, especially when you're growing so quickly? How do you balance between short-term growth or short-term revenue to meet specific targets or KPIs, or bring on additional team members, or to meet specific goals, versus the more kind of like longer-term vision for what you guys are trying to achieve?
Yeah, that is really hard. Ultimately, you have to prioritize the short term if you aren't going to make it to the long term. If you've got 3 months of runway in the bank, you can't prioritize something that's going to not save you in those next 3 months. The way I think about it is prioritize the short term, but don't drop the long term, because there's always you're going to constantly run up against urgent short-term problems, and you could just spend the next 5 years solving all of them and never focus on the long term. So I guess it's a balance. I try and set aside Sundays. That's my day outside of the office, well, actually at the office, but where there's no team at the office, to think about the long term a bit more. When there's no fires to put out, everything's running smoothly, and you're not being, there's no meetings or anything like that, and I can think about the long term and sort of allow myself a space to do that without distracting myself from the short-term thing I need to fix this week or this month. So I find actual blocking of time or space, like we used to talk about long-term things over lunch with the team. So we'd sort of constrain those pie-in-the-sky conversations to out of the office, back when we used to have lunch as a team every day. So or when you're out going for a walk with the team or getting a coffee. I think just breaking them up helps you not get bogged down into continuous long-term thinking to the point where you don't fix the bug that's in the website today.
Sure. So it's interesting what you kind of mentioned about, if you've only got 3 months of runway, it doesn't really matter what your long-term thing is. And I think that to me is like one of the biggest roles of CEOs, is just to make sure that you're alive for long enough to make sure that you're there for the long-term vision to even be
Survival,
a thing.
yeah.
Survival is key.
Yeah.
But just kind of jumping back to what you mentioned about you just having the time on Sundays to yourself to do that. How do you go about doing that on your own? Is there a structure that you have in terms of the way that you sort of plan your long-term thinking, or is it just like a whiteboarding session? How do you structure that?
That's a good question. I'm actually naturally not the most structured thinker. My business partner is incredibly structured. So usually we'll flesh some of that stuff out together, but we'll come from different angles. We'll come with our different beliefs about where we're going to be in a couple of years and where we're going to be in a year. And then we'll heavily debate that, and he'll bring a lot of that structure. So yeah, I don't tend to have a lot of it. I write down things. I think that helps. My structure is writing down my thoughts, or creating alternate versions of our cash flow that sort of give us examples of what the future could look like if we did this or that, or if we grew this way with this team, where does that get us? That's kind of my running scenarios, I guess, is probably my structure. And kind of trying to somehow imagine the business without the constraints of today, going, okay, in 10 years, or maybe less, in 5 years, we're going to have wheel-based drones delivering groceries, right? I've seen them in the UK. They reckon they're going to get the cost of the last mile down to £1. When that happens, that means consumers can order whatever they want from wherever they want, essentially. So what does our business look like if that happens? And so I guess running scenarios like that helps you get your thinking out of the next 3 months and sort of your cash flow goals, and keeps like one eye on where it's going in the longer term.
Sure. So is there any kind of energy or resources that you would devote then? So like, if you were to say, look, in 5 years, we think that the market will look like this, do you kind of future-proof YourGrocer now, or do you spend any time actually changing not changing, but I guess deviating any of the resources towards kind of future-proofing the business?
No. The way we do that, yes and no. We don't do anything about that now. Like, I don't spend time researching drones now or anything like that. But we do try and set our team and workflow up in a way that makes things easy to change. So we have quite a team-driven prioritization process where if anyone wants to bring anything forward, it's quite easy to do so. And I think that's... we try and gear ourselves up for change, because one thing we know that's definitely going to happen is the business is going to need to change a lot, as it grows. Like, we've changed, our fulfillment model has changed 5 or 6 times practically since we started. So the core of it hasn't changed much, but like the way it works has changed quite a bit. So we know things are going to need to change. So gearing ourselves to change quickly and often is probably the way we future-proof it. And I think that's probably the only way you can do it, because if you try and future-proof against drones, you might realize you probably won't get it right. It'll be something else that, it'll be meal kits that completely disrupts it, and whoops, you picked the wrong thing to future-proof against. So I don't think that works.
Yeah, in terms of change as well. Again, for founders, it can be difficult when you've made up your mind on, we're going to do things in a particular way in the forward, and this is non-negotiable, and then circumstances and things change that force you to do that. So I guess one example that we were kind of, again, talking about before we turned on the mic was, I think when we first met, you had your own delivery trucks, and then there was a phase when you moved away from that, and now you've recently sort of brought them back as well. Yep. Can you share a little bit about, I guess, just your experience of going through that, and what are the things that people should look for that should help them make that decision to change? So right. What would it look like for someone to go, actually maybe this isn't the right approach, or this isn't the right strategy, we should look to do something else?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, so we've changed the business quite a bit. I think we changed it too slowly because we were very attached to our quite almost dogmatic ideas and how our business will grow. In day one, I always said, we'll never have a physical warehouse or distribution center, because our model is superior to that, and we don't want a physical space, and that's why we're brilliant and we've got the best model. We now have a distribution center. We should have probably had a distribution center a year earlier than we did. We've got a lot of benefit out of it now, but that I confused I confused something that wasn't a first principle with I thought that not owning a warehouse was something that was a core first principle to me, and then only slowly unpacked that and realized, no, it's not. We have these other principles, but warehouses are not something that I should be. I should have decided from day one whether we do or don't do, and I think that, and I've unpacked many of those things over the last few years, and often I'm unpacking them later than I should, right? And so one thing that I think is crucial that I'm trying to do, and I haven't nailed it because I still keep finding things that I have said, we'll never do this, or this is the way we do it, and this is what we believe about this. This is part of our mission. You realize, like we've always said that, okay, our whole mission is to get you to buy from local shops in your area. And right now we're delivering from South Melbourne Market out to Frankston, right? How does that fit with our mission? Well, eventually we want you to be in Frankston buying from shops in Frankston, but that's a long road to get the right shops in Frankston and get the right delivery economics up there. So we're sort of taking a detour that allows us to deliver from the best shops across Melbourne, all across Melbourne. And we should have done that earlier. But because it didn't fit with our sort of hyper-local approach, the way we were communicating it, we didn't even look at it or consider it. So being really clear on what are our first principles and what are not, what are just the way we do things, what are the tactics that we're using now that are on the table for change, and what are principles that we will never deviate from. I'm now becoming more and more wary of anything that I say or anyone else in the team says that is, we'll never do this, or here's what the business looks like and will always look like.
Sure. It's interesting. Like, I think coming back to first principles is really important, but also extremely difficult for most people to do, especially when you're so close to the idea and so close to the vision of it. I see so many founders who are trying to build an MVP of the product that, it's not, an MVP should be essentially testing what the first principle is of your business to go, is this validated and can we build a business around that? It's, infinitely harder to do that when you've got so many different moving parts and the business is moving so quickly. Again, do you have any advice on how a founder is there an approach that you would recommend in terms of finding the first principle for your business?
Well, so first principles, the way I understand them, are things you believe to be like fundamentally true, that you base your other beliefs or ideas off. There's not many first principles that I think it's, for me, more important than finding what those are is like being clear on what those are not, or being really open-minded to the idea that some things that you think are right today with the way things are done might not be in the future. I think that's probably, to me, more important than finding what those principles actually are. Unless, I mean, there are some obvious ones, values-based principles, things like, humans are all equal, and like I personally don't believe that principle for me is going to change in the future. But then there are others that are based around a delivery model that may change in the future. If we say to ourselves, one of our first principles is that we always want our delivery drivers to, we always want to use people to do deliveries, and we'll never use drones because we want to make sure all our drivers have jobs for the future. That might sound great now, but in 5 years' time, we might be completely uncompetitive and go under because now everyone else is using driverless cars and we're the only ones left, paying good money for people to deliver. So as bad as it sounds, like we need to be aware of what those are, not what are our first principles and what are not. Really, most of it will come down to like your values around the business, and then paying attention to the customer. And we realized after a while, we used to sort of look at shops and customers as both as like equal customers to us in a way. As a sort of a two-sided marketplace would look at customers. But then we realized after quite a while, the consumer buying groceries is the one true customer, and shops are our partners in that, which means sometimes we need to, crack the whip a little bit and tell our shops, get them doing a better job around quality, or push them a little bit on margins, and this is the kind of stuff you wouldn't do if you see them as a customer, but now that we see them as partners, we change that. So being clear on who your customer is, I guess, is like helps you get closer to those principles.
Yeah, I guess it's that focus, because there's that temptation to go, oh, we also want to do this for delivery drivers, and we also want to do these other benefits. But I guess part of that is, again, sort of moving forward, if you have a clear focus on what is the one thing that you want to do and do better than anyone else. Everything else, as you mentioned, you then sort of go, okay, is it in the best interest for what we're trying to do, which is connecting independent grocers to consumers to look at drone delivery versus is that a better model for that business? So, again, something else that we kind of spoke about as well, and I think you've kind of touched on this, is the faster a business grows, and the more people you hire and all of those things, there are additional sort of complications and more tension. Can you share what it's been like in terms of the journey of YourGrocer and how that tension personally for you has changed?
Sure, yeah. So for the first couple of years, when we were relatively small, the team was small, our revenue was small, our funding was small. It felt like there was not a big consequence of us closing down the business, for example. Everyone knows that there's always a threat of you failing at some point. So, we knew that. We sort of were really aware of that, but it never really worried us too much because, it was all one big experiment. Now that we're almost 5 years in, we've got about 20 staff. We're selling a decent amount of groceries every year, and we've raised a reasonably good amount of capital. The idea of failure now feels a lot more significant. It feels like the consequences are higher. So although the business has never been in a better spot, it also feels like failure now would be a lot more disappointing than failure a few years ago. So that, like, personally, that has been, I find that like an interesting situation. Like I've never been happier. I've never been more stressed at the same time. So it's a strange thing. Yeah,
no, absolutely. Again, I was just mentioning we hired 2 new staff, and the more people that you have, the more, obviously you have to consider that if something goes wrong and you make a bad decision and that things kind of go under, it affects a lot more people than just you as well, which is a lot of, additional tension or stress to deal with.
Yeah, you do feel that sense of responsibility. I really like the idea that we create meaningful employment for 20 people, and beyond that, meaningful employment at the shops who are packing products every day for us. So, that's fantastic. And if that goes away, I'd be very disappointed. A lot more disappointed than if it were just 2 or 3. It's like constantly feel like the stakes are getting higher and higher. But I guess that will never stop.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what does success for YourGrocer look like to you?
What does success for YourGrocer look like? Really, like, when I'll be really happy is when we've actually made a dent in the competitive landscape of food and grocery in Australia. That's a big long-term goal that, we might not see until after I'm done with YourGrocer. It might be 5 or 10 years down the track. But I would really love to see a much more healthy and competitive food and grocery landscape. Online, the predictions are that online will grow to about 5 or 6% over the next few years, like 5 or 6% of total grocery sales in Australia. I think we're grossly underestimating that. With Amazon hitting the scene today, actually, we're going to see a lot of complacent retailers pick up their game in Australia, and I think online's going to online in general, but online grocery in Australia is going to pick up quite fast. So I think we've got the potential here to build a really big business, and the exciting thing about the space we're in is that grocery is the largest retail category in the country. Even though you're only talking about 3% of it that's online now, that's $3 billion. So it's a big, fun market, and success would be to take a decent chunk of that. But ultimately, I'd love to sort of, at the end of the day, dethrone Coles and Woolies from that duopoly status and and make things a little more competitive.
Absolutely. Looking forward to following your story and getting you back on the show when you've made that dent. Morgan, thanks so much for coming on the show today. So a big part of the reason why I wanted to launch the Hustle series was to help join the dots between a lot of people in the community and some of the guests that we have on the show. So my final question to you is, for anyone listening at home, what can they do to help, or what's something that you currently need help or want to be connected onto?
Sure. So our biggest growth comes through word of mouth. So and our typical customer is a family with young kids. It's usually people, mum, dad, a couple of kids, used to go to the shops, want to support local shops, but end up at Coles and Woolies because they're really pressed for time. So if you know anyone, a family with young kids, obviously we deliver to everyone, right? We're not only delivering to these people, but they tend to be the ones who are not using Uber Eats as much and wanting to get good quality groceries delivered. So share something on your Facebook or on your Twitter and tell your friends and family about YourGrocer. If they're across Melbourne, we're only delivering across Melbourne at the moment, Metro Melbourne. So basically anyone living in Melbourne we deliver to. So tell your friends and family about us and give us a try. YourGrocer.com.au.
Fantastic. Morgan, once again, thanks for coming on. For anyone who wants to say hello, find out more, get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
On Twitter, Morgan Ranieri, or send me an email.
Yeah. Great. Cool.
I also get along to most of the Startup Vic meetups. So any of those, come and say hi.
Absolutely. I'll make sure all of those links are in the show notes. Once again, Morgan, thanks for coming on.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to episode 4 of the Startup Playbook Hustle. You can find the show notes of my interview with Morgan, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Want to feature on the Startup Playbook Hustle? Shoot me an email at rohit@startupplaybook.co or fill out the form linked onto the show notes available at our website. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at episode 74 of the Startup Playbook podcast next week.